This is Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Peddie. A $117 billion budget and a slate of new laws as Florida lawmakers wrapped up the 60-day legislative session on Friday. Among those bills are new restrictions on social media use by teenagers, limits to where people experiencing homelessness are allowed to sleep, and some tweaks to the troubled homeowners insurance market. On today's episode, we'll dive into the details of what passed, what didn't make it through, and what it means for residents of the greater Tampa Bay region. Joining us are political journalist William March. William, thanks for being here.
Oh, hi, Matthew. Nice to be here.
And by Zoom, Tampa Bay Times, Miami Herald Tallahassee correspondent Lawrence Mower. Lawrence, good to see you again too.
You too, Matthew.
So, William, talk us through the social media restrictions bill. House Speaker Paul Renner made it a priority at the start of the session. What did lawmakers end up passing?
Well, they passed a weakened version after Governor Ron DeSantis expressed concern about the constitutionality of the bill, as well he might. What they actually passed would do a couple of things. Kids 13 and under can't have accounts. 14 to 16, parents have to provide permission. And for adult sites, it's 18 plus. Now, laws very much like that have been subject to challenges, several of them successful, at least so far, in a couple of other states. Mm-hmm. And they're being sued by an organization called NetChoice, which is sort of a conglomeration of some of the biggest social media sites, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. And NetChoice has pretty much signaled that they will file litigation over this law also.
Mm-hmm. Lawrence, I want to ask about some of the pushback to the bill because Governor Ron DeSantis was among those voicing his opposition. He vetoed the first version of it, so that was a revamped version that reached his desk late last week. What does this conflict between the Republican Speaker and DeSantis tell you about the governor's hold on the legislature this session?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. This was basically a situation in which the social media bill kind of ran afoul of the governor and legislature's parental rights movement. Basically, the previous version of the bill just said anyone under 16 can't be on these social media sites. And the governor said, well, I think parents should have a say in this. And the speaker said, no, this would be a poison pill. We're not going to allow parents to basically opt in or kind of allow their kids to use social media. And when the governor basically said, essentially, I'm going to veto it unless you do this. Mm-hmm. And this new arrangement, the new bill was basically kind of a way for both the speaker and the governor to save face. And, we did see signs this session, other signs of kind of the legislature kind of growing out of DeSantis' shadow, so to speak. These are still House Speaker and Senate President who are very much in lockstep with the governor. But, one of the things you mentioned, the budget at the top of the show, yep. One of the things that I thought was interesting and other people thought was interesting in the budget is that, the governor has all these initiatives like New College of Florida that he's just throwing millions and millions of dollars at. The state guard is another thing that he's asking for a ton of money on that. And what the legislature has been said this year in the budget is that, well, we'll give you some of this money, but we're going to now start requiring reports about how you're actually spending this money, mm-hmm. how you're actually enacting the legislation that we're passing each year, which is new. I mean, they only do this in situations where there's a big question about how this money is being spent. And with DeSantis, his administration is extremely secretive about how they spend their money. It's hard to even get public records from them on this stuff. Mm-hmm. And the legislature, they've been kind of annoyed with this. They've been caught flat-footed. The legislature basically assigns how the money is spent, and DeSantis and state agencies are the ones who are actually supposed to carry it out. And the legislature's been kind of annoyed with how the governor has been basically spending this money, or in many cases not spending it. There's a lot of money that they've assigned for like DeSantis' migrant relocation program that just hasn't been spent.
William, let me come back to you for a moment. Lawmakers want cities and towns to stop people from sleeping on public property. This is House Bill 1365. What are the specifics of what got signed here?
Well, actually, Matthew, the truth is I have a lot of questions about this bill and how it's going to work. I don't think it's real obvious. Essentially, it forbids local governments from allowing people to sleep on sidewalks in public places. The only enforcement mechanism, though, is that it gives other citizens the right to sue the government if they allow homeless people to sleep near your property or in a way that it affects your property. The alternative that's provided is for them to set up homeless camps, and these camps would have to have security, health care, other services. But there's not much money in the bill to pay for the cities or local governments to do that. And it also says that these homeless camps cannot be in a location where they're going to affect anybody's property value, residential or commercial. So where are these camps going to go? How are the local governments going to pay for the services that are required there? A lot of the reason that homeless people don't want to go to shelters is danger, security. Are they going to be able to solve that problem in these camps? And then finally, a local government can declare a hardship and get out of providing some of the services that are supposedly required in these camps. So what is actually going to happen? I have a lot of questions about how that's going to work.
Yeah. Lawrence, to this point too, the city of Tampa tried setting up an encampment for a couple of months for people who are homeless in 2020. This was part of its pandemic response. Now, the cost of that camp was reported to be about $60,000 per person per month. I'm wondering what you've been hearing about the potential cost for cities to try and set up designated places for people to sleep.
The cost is a really big question, and we don't really have any good figures for that yet. As you mentioned, some cities have kind of tried this. That one in Tampa was actually run by the Catholic Diocese of St. Petersburg, and they have run a similar site in Clearwater, a much larger one. And there, the cost is about $2.1 million a year, they told me, which is, not that much. But, we're talking about, they have all their meals donated. They have a lot of others, services that are provided at low or no cost. And for example, places like Gainesville have tried this, and it was a total disaster there. Initially, these camps start out great, but the big problem is a camp is not a solution to homelessness. The best practices are you help homeless people transition into permanent housing. You need to have a strategy to do that. And what Gainesville found is that they didn't have a strategy to do that. And so these camps descended in the camp they had there descended into a lot of crime, drug use. There were rumors of human trafficking going on. Basically, you had people living in these camps for years with no real structure, no governance. And it was just these people became victims of other people who would move in and try to prey on them. So the real problem here is that the devil's basically in the details. Counties could do a great job with this or not a good job with this. It just depends on how it's carried out.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Florida Matters. We're talking to political journalists William March and Lawrence Mower, taking a look back at the session that just ended last week. I want to talk about homeowners insurance. Now, this has dominated headlines over the last couple of years. There wasn't much legislation to speak of addressing insurance companies dumping customers or the cost of insurance this session, but there is one bill to allow, quote, lightly regulated insurance companies to take some policy off citizens' hands. Now, Citizens, of course, is theoretically the insurer of last resort, although it does have a lot of people on its books right now. Lawrence, what can you tell us about this bill and the potential impact of it?
Yeah, what the legislation did was basically if you have a second home in Florida, so say you're a snowbird in Michigan and you live there most of the year and come down here during the winter, citizens can kick you off the rolls and send you to what's known as a surplus lines insurance company. So there's basically two groups of insurance companies that kind of operate. There are admitted companies, which are companies that are regulated with the state. The state approves their rates, the kind of forms they send homeowners, and these companies have to report their finances to the state, so the state knows that these companies are healthy. Surplus lines companies are basically specialty insurers that are largely unregulated by the state. They insure all kinds of things from luxury homes to celebrities will kind of get a custom policy. For example, Keith Richards, middle finger, it was insured by a surplus lines insurer. And so these companies are unregulated, and the state has always historically said, you know what, we're not going to put citizens, customers, normal homeowners onto these surplus lines insurers because they're unregulated. It is a higher risk for the homeowner because they have all kinds of different clauses and things that aren't normally consumer protections that don't exist for surplus lines insurers that do exist for admitted carriers. For example, if you have an open claim with a admitted carrier and that company goes under while you still haven't been paid, you're guaranteed by the state to have your claim paid. For surplus lines insurers, that doesn't exist. And so for second homes in Florida, they've said now, okay, we're going to allow you to allow surplus lines insurers basically take out your policy there, which is a major that they've never done that before.
Yeah. If we could switch gears for a moment here, William, there's some legislation to abolish civilian police oversight boards. Now, St. Petersburg and Tampa both have civilian police oversight boards. What power do these boards actually wield, and what would this law change mean for them?
Well, the law change would essentially mean they'd go out of business. What the legislation says is that cities and counties cannot make or enforce any ordinance concerning investigation of accusations of police misconduct. And as you mentioned, Tampa and St. Pete both have these boards. The one in Tampa has been a subject of controversy for years as to how much power, how much authority it should have, and who should appoint its members. Should it be the mayor, who might be viewed, depending on the person holding the office, to be more favorable to the police department, or should it be the city council, who would have more of a citizens or neighborhood orientation? So this has been controversial. Also, should the board have the ability to subpoena a law officer? Should the board have its own lawyer? These questions have been controversial for years in Tampa, and they were only just settled with controversies on both sides last summer. And now this bill comes along and abolishes the board, and also the one in St. Petersburg, which has less power than the one in Tampa. The goal of the bill, it says, is to make investigations of police officers' misconduct and how they're handled, to make it uniform statewide. And that's basically the rationale for abolishing these boards. The ones in St. Pete and Tampa are two of 21 cities that have such boards, and the legal experts in the city attorney's offices tell me they will basically go out of business.
Much more to talk about. You're listening to Florida Matters. We're recapping the 2024 legislative session with political journalist William March and Lawrence Mower, a reporter at the Tampa Bay Times Miami Herald Tallahassee Bureau. Up next, Hillsborough County gets the okay to spend some transportation tax money, controversy over moves to loosen child labour restrictions, and a sweeping healthcare law change. That and much more when we return. Welcome back to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Peddie. Let's get back to the conversation with political journalists William March and Lawrence Mower about the legislative session that just finished and how a slate of new laws will affect residents of our region. Well, about $589 million collected for a Hillsborough County transportation tax has been tied up since the Florida Supreme Court struck down the tax 3 years ago. This session, state lawmakers got to decide how to divvy up that money. Just over half of that could go towards county transportation projects. Lawrence, let me start with you on this. What does this mean for how people get around in Hillsborough County? What happens to the rest of that?
Well, the short answer is we don't quite know what kind of road projects and whatnot that's going to go to. But yeah, I mean, it's less than half of the money going to road projects. The rest of it is going to basically pay people back who paid this tax. $170 million is going to tax refunds for people who apply for a tax refund, and also to pay the legal fees that fought the lawsuits running this tax. And another $161 million is going to some kind of county tax holiday that we don't really know yet the details of, but it will presumably be some kind of probably sales tax exemption for a certain period that would basically help, refund people, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Moving on from transportation to child labour restrictions. Now, this was a bill that drew a lot of attention and criticism. William, just kind of get us caught up to speed, folks who maybe haven't been paying so much attention. What does this law do, and what was the kind of process? What happens next?
Well, the original version of the law, as it was proposed, and I think it was proposed in the House, would have virtually eliminated or close to eliminated restrictions on hours that young people can work. And the arguments are that there should be restrictions on how long kids can work while they're in school because it takes them away from their education. The argument on the other side is that the kids need the money. The parents can make a judgment as to whether they're working too many hours. The original version lifted a whole lot of restrictions that go back many decades were eliminated. The bill was weakened in the Senate. In other words, many of the restrictions were not lifted in the version of the bill that was finally passed. Some child labor amounts that were criticized, it would still allow 6 straight days of scheduling a 16, 17-year-old to work. It would allow up to 30 hours a week. And one of the things that was removed was allowing children into more dangerous occupations.
Like roofing, for example.
Well, working off the ground on construction sites, anything over 6 feet high. That would have been allowed, and eliminating that restriction was taken out of the bill, so it's still not allowed. And what you're seeing here is an argument that's been made by a lot of conservative Republicans in the Senate, viewing the high school education period of a kid's life in particular as more of a career preparation or occupational training period than traditional education.
Mm-hmm. Also wrapped up in this bill is a preemptive move to stop local governments from imposing regulations on companies that employ outdoor workers to keep them safe in the heat. What about this? Because this was kind of a separate issue, right? And it kind of got wrapped together into this bill.
Yes, it did. It got stuck back in at the last moment, as I recall. There aren't any. As of right now, there aren't any cities that have done this, but a lot of cities are talking about it. Miami had a proposal that they were working on, I believe, and this preempts that. This prevents them from doing that. And once again, as with the child labor, those arguing in favor of it were major industries that have a lot at stake, a lot to gain or lose, and the legislature went, for the most part, along with what those industries were arguing. Mm-hmm. The preemption is just the latest in a long list of powers that the legislature has taken away from local governments and arrogated to itself.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about health care. Now, one of Senate President Kathleen Passidomo's priorities this session was a Live Healthy bill to essentially boost the number of doctors and other healthcare providers in Florida. Lawrence, what ended up passing here, and what difference could this make for Floridians? And I guess on the other side of that, what doesn't this bill do? What doesn't this law change do?
Yeah, this was a sweeping set of legislation, 6 bills in all. And the goal was basically to boost the number of doctors and nurses in the state. And these bills, I mean, they do a lot of things, but some of the things they do is basically offer tuition reimbursement to doctors and nurses. Of course, medical school is extremely expensive. One of the real consumer-friendly focuses of the bills is forbids debt collection after 3 years on medical debts.
Wow.
Medical debt is one of the leading sources of bankruptcy for Americans. Many Americans hold medical debt. Mm-hmm. And so this would waive it after 3 years, basically, or forbid the collection after 3 years, which is a big deal.
It is a big deal. I kind of wonder how that's going to be rolled out, though. It would be interesting 3 years' time from now to see what the impact of that is.
Yeah, right now the limit is 5 years. And so this was a couple of years shy of that. Whether or not this legislation will make a big difference to Floridians, the medical debt part aside, remains to be seen. I mean, I didn't see any projections from the legislature on how many more nurses and doctors would be created through this. And of course, it doesn't address the elephant in the room with healthcare in Florida, which is that we have a ridiculously high number of people who are uninsured. And expanding Medicaid, which is something that Florida is one of 10 states that have still not expanded Medicaid, would give insurance to about 800,000 Floridians, it's estimated. And that is something that the legislature has refused to do. They said at the beginning of session, the Senate president said, we're not going to do this. So basically, quit talking about it. But this is an issue that still remains unresolved. And the reason why, Senate President Kathleen Passidomo did not want to do this, she says, is because, well, the wait times to get a doctor is so long that what would the good be in giving people more giving more people insurance? And of course, the counter to that is that insurance covers chronic care, chronic illnesses, cancer, of course, being one of them, which a lot of people still get cancer. And so this is an issue that still remains. I don't know if DeSantis would ever approve Medicaid expansion, but nevertheless, this problem of, so many Floridians not having insurance is still out there.
William, there were a bunch of education bills kind of floating around the legislative session this year, including all those things. Talk us through the highlights of the education component of this legislative session. What got through, what didn't? What does it mean?
Well, as you mentioned, one thing that did get through was a bill to teach communism, teach about supposedly the dangers of communism in all the K-12 grades. I do not understand how kindergartners, first graders, second graders are going to understand economic theory involving communism. But that's one thing that did pass. There was a move to heavily deregulate public schools, change a lot of the requirements, mandates imposed by the legislature. Among the major ones that would have been eliminated were use of algebra and language arts exams for graduation, the requirement that those pass. That was weakened. Those exams are still in place, and some of the deregulation passed, but a lot of it didn't. There were some other culture war issues on education that passed. Schools are now allowed to use chaplains, religious figures, volunteers, instead of guidance counselors if they don't have them. There was a new law passed forbidding teacher training programs from training teachers on any kind of identity politics. And this is yet another law applied to public school curriculums and teaching that looks like it could be very difficult for education professionals to understand and know how to put into place. What's identity politics? Well, the law defines it, and I'll just read it here. No training on theories based on the theory that systematic racism, sexism, oppression, and privileges are inherent in the institutions of the United States and were created to maintain social, political, and economic inequities. In other words, teaching those theories is forbidden. Now, how are legislators supposed to parse what does and doesn't meet that definition? We'll see if they can.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that there have been some pushes by legislators who try and find some money to fix Florida's crumbling prisons. What happened this session?
Virtually nothing is the answer to that. A state study, the state hired a research corporation to do a study of its prison system. And what the study said was that over the next, I think, 5 to 10 years, Lawrence might be able to correct me on that, what's needed is somewhere between $6 and $12 billion, depending on how far the state wants to go in improving and fixing its prison system, which is basically falling apart. what ended up getting passed is about $100 million for fixes and some money to continue to allow National Guard members to fill in for correctional officers because turnover among correctional officers has been so high. So, in other words, there was no movement made on what the state itself, a state-sponsored study, says is one of the greatest problems facing the state.
As we wrap up here, Lawrence, what were your sort of biggest takeaways from this session?
Well, that it was a lot quieter than last year. You know, when the governor was preparing to run for president, as everyone in Tallahassee and Florida and the country was expecting, he had a really aggressive agenda in the legislature on all kinds of culture war stuff and school and going after woke and whatnot. And this year he had no real agenda, so it was much quieter. I mean, that was a notable thing. You did see some pushback from the legislature on some DeSantis stuff, but DeSantis didn't have a lot of policies this year to push back on.
Yeah,
frankly, that's probably the biggest thing. They passed a lot of initiatives that we've talked about that, I would not be surprised if we're back next year and the legislature is working on tweaks or fixes to a lot of this stuff. So it was not nearly as exciting as last year, I'd say.
William, how would you characterize the session briefly?
Well, like Lawrence said, quiet, comparatively little done, and one of the things that Lawrence just mentioned that I think is really prominent, really conspicuous here, is how many major problems got very little action from this legislation. Lawrence and a couple of other Tallahassee reporters collaborated this past week on an excellent story about what didn't happen, what cans got kicked down the road. The prisons system is one of them that we mentioned. Property insurance fixes are another. To me, that's one of the major points in this session.
Mm-hmm. We've been speaking with political journalist William March and Tampa Bay Times Miami Herald Tallahassee correspondent Lawrence Mower about the 2024 legislative session. William, thank you for joining us.
Oh, glad to be here.
And Lawrence, thank you as well.
Happy to be here.
You can hear more about the potential impact of the new social media bill on our Florida Matters podcast. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That's our show for this week. Our executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Blake Bass engineered this episode. I'm Matthew Peddie. Thanks for listening.